What would you do if everything you believed about love, loyalty, and trust shattered in an instant? If the person you swore to protect, who promised to be yours forever, wasn't just unfaithful, but lying in a way so twisted, so unthinkable, that your mind couldn't even process what your eyes were seeing? This isn't about war. This isn't about an enemy across the battlefield. This is about what happens when the person you love becomes the one who destroys you. A single gunshot. Then silence. John Walker had seen death before. He had spent years in places where gunfire meant survival, where men like him followed orders without hesitation. He had been trained to eliminate threats, to act before thinking, because thinking could get you killed. But on that night, there was no battlefield, no orders. Just a man, standing in the doorway of his own home, staring at something he was never meant to see. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. Before we uncover the truth behind this unsettling and haunting case, make sure to hit like, subscribe and share for more true crime tales that peel back the shadows of human nature. John Walker, Navy SEAL, 29 years old. A man built on discipline. A man who had spent a lifetime controlling his emotions. But love is not war. And when it came to Sarah, John was defenseless. She was everything he thought he wanted. Bright, beautiful, the kind of person who lit up a room just by walking into it. He had fallen fast, the way soldiers do, as if every moment could be their last. And for 2 years, they were inseparable. When he was deployed, she was the one thing he held on to. When he came home, she was waiting. And when he asked her to marry him, there was no doubt in his mind. Sarah was his forever. But nothing is ever that simple. Sarah had secrets. She had grown up in a fractured home, raised by a woman who saw love as control, who blurred the lines between power and intimacy in ways that left scars too deep to be seen. Her stepmother, Laura, was not the nurturing kind. She was the kind of woman who made you need her, who pulled you close and never let go. Then there was Emma, Sarah's stepsister. Younger, impressionable, a shadow trailing behind Sarah's light. And when Sarah let them back into her life, she had no idea what it would cost her. Neither did John. He never questioned the late-night visits, the hushed conversations, the way Sarah's smile flickered whenever her phone lit up with a message she wouldn't explain. He trusted her. Until the night he came home early. John had been out drinking with his SEAL brothers, celebrating another return home, another mission survived. It was supposed to be a good night. But then his phone buzzed. A message. Just one line. You should come home now. No name. No explanation. Just those words. He drove fast. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something he had been ignoring for months, now clawing its way to the surface. He wasn't prepared for what he would find on the other side of that bedroom door. No one ever is. John had always known that Sarah's past wasn't perfect. Everyone carries something with them, ghosts from childhood that never quite leave. But love makes you believe you can be the one to fix things. That you can love someone enough to erase whatever hurt came before you. Laura came back into Sarah's life like a shadow slipping through an open door. 4 years, Sarah had barely spoken about her, only mentioning her in passing, like a name she didn't want to say out loud. When she did, it was always with a tightness in her voice, like she was walking a thin line between resentment and something harder to explain. Then, one day, everything changed. Sarah had gone from dismissing Laura's existence to suddenly letting her in again. It started slow. A phone call here. A message there. Then, suddenly, Laura was back. It wasn't just the occasional lunch or a quick catch-up. It was visits that lasted late into the night. It was whispered conversations that stopped the second John walked into the room. Laura wasn't the kind of woman you could ignore. She carried herself like someone who had always known how to get what she wanted. She was striking in a way that made people uncomfortable. Too much makeup, a dress always just a little too tight, a presence that demanded attention. John had spent years around dangerous men, and there was something about Laura that made him uneasy. Rumors had always followed her. Some said she had a habit of seducing the men in her life and discarding them when she got bored. Others claimed it wasn't just men. There was even talk about her relationship with her ex-husband's brother, a scandal that had splintered their family apart. It didn't take much to imagine that Sarah had been just another piece in whatever twisted game Laura was playing. Sarah swore it wasn't like that. She told John that Laura had changed, that she had grown, that she just wanted a second chance to be the mother she should have been. But something about it didn't sit right. Laura wasn't trying to rebuild a relationship. She was pulling Sarah into something. And she wasn't doing it alone. There was also Emma. Emma had been nothing more than a name for most of John and Sarah's relationship. The stepsister. Younger. Quiet. A girl Sarah had known when they were kids but had barely spoken about in years. Then, like Laura, she was suddenly there. First in conversation. Then in person. Emma was only 21, still figuring out who she was. She idolized Sarah, hung on her every word, smiled in that innocent way that made her seem like she was just happy to be included. But something about it wasn't normal. The three of them, Sarah, Laura, and Emma, became inseparable. John would come home to find them together, sitting too close, whispering in a way that made the air in the room feel thick. Sometimes, he would catch glances exchanged between them that were too fast to understand but slow enough to notice. He would hear laughter coming from the other room, but when he walked in, it would stop. He told himself he was imagining things. He was a soldier, trained to be suspicious, to see patterns even when they weren't there. He had spent so much time in war zones, expecting danger at every turn, that maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. So, he ignored it. And that was his first mistake. That night, he had no reason to think anything was wrong. He had spent the evening drinking with his SEAL brothers, celebrating life, the way they always did after making it home. He had laughed, taken shots, thrown his arm around men who had saved his life more times than he could count. Then his phone buzzed. A message. Just one line. Your wife has visitors, but it doesn't look like family time. His heart slammed against his ribs. The room around him disappeared. The laughter, the music, the voices. It was all gone. He stood up too fast, knocking his chair back. His hands shook as he fumbled for his keys. The guys asked if he was okay. He barely answered. His feet carried him out the door before his mind had even caught up. The drive home felt like it took hours. His fingers were tight around the wheel, his pulse hammering so hard it made his vision blur. He could barely think. Could barely breathe. He didn't know what he was about to walk into. But something inside him whispered, whatever it was going to change everything. John had spent years training for moments of chaos. His body knew how to react before his mind did. In combat, hesitation meant death. But this wasn't war. This was home. This was his wife. The tires screeched as he pulled into the driveway. The house was dark. Too dark. The kind of quiet that didn't feel right. He sat in the car for a second, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He wasn't drunk, not really, but the alcohol hummed low in his blood, making the edges of his thoughts sharp. He stepped out. The air was still, but his pulse wasn't. His keys felt heavy in his hand as he unlocked the front door. It swung open without a sound. Inside, nothing. No voices. No movement. Just silence. Then, a sound. Soft. Faint. A whisper. Then another. John closed the door behind him, his heartbeat climbing into his throat. He moved without thinking, slow, careful steps, years of training guiding his body forward. The house was dim, but there was light coming from down the hall. Their bedroom. His feet carried him toward it. He wasn't breathing anymore, just listening. Another whisper. Then, a soft gasp. Something clenched deep in his stomach. The door was open. Just enough. Just enough for him to see. And then, everything inside him stopped. Sarah. She was there, wrapped in sheets, her skin bare, her body tangled in the limbs of two others. Laura. Emma. A mess of bodies, pressed together, moving together, hands gripping, lips parting, lost in each other, in the heat of whatever this was, whatever they had been hiding from him. His wife. His wife. John couldn't move. He couldn't blink. The air was gone from his lungs. His body felt like it didn't belong to him anymore. He had spent years learning to control his emotions, to act with precision, to never let impulse dictate action. But standing there, looking at the woman he loved wrapped in the arms of her own family, something inside him unraveled. His pulse pounded against his skull, so loud it drowned out everything else. Sarah turned. Their eyes met. Her face changed. The pleasure melted into something else, something raw and terrified. "John, wait." The words barely made it past her lips before his hand was already reaching. The pistol was there before he even realized he had grabbed it. Cold metal against his palm, familiar, reassuring. His fingers curled around it, muscles tightening, movement so natural, so instinctual, that it didn't even feel like a decision. Sarah sat up, her hands raised, her eyes wide with something that wasn't just fear, it was knowing. She knew. She knew there was no coming back from this. Laura gasped. Emma scrambled back, covering herself, eyes darting between John and Sarah, frozen in shock. John's mind wasn't thinking in words anymore. Just flashes. Images. The way Sarah had laughed at their wedding. The way she had held his face and promised forever. The way she had looked at him like he was the only man in the world. Lies. A sharp breath. His finger tightened. The first shot cracked through the air. Sarah's body jolted. A burst of red bloomed across her chest. She sucked in a sharp, wet breath, her hands reaching for something she couldn't grasp. The second shot came before she even started to fall. Blood on the sheets. On the walls. On him. Laura screamed. Emma dove off the bed, crawling for cover, sobbing, begging. John didn't hear them. His ears were ringing. His hands were steady. Sarah was still looking at him, but there was no light left in her eyes. The woman he had loved, the woman he had sworn to protect, was gone. And he had been the one to take her. Laura's hands were slick with sweat as she fumbled with the phone. Her fingers trembled so violently she almost dropped it before pressing it to her ear. The screen was smeared with red. She didn't know if it was Sarah's blood or her own. Maybe both. The call connected. 911, what's your emergency? Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling too fast, too shallow. Words tangled in her throat. Please. Oh my God. He just killed her. Please. The dispatcher's voice was calm, controlled, asking her to slow down, to repeat herself, but she wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on John, who hadn't moved. He stood there, the gun still in his hand, fingers loose around the grip, like he didn't know whether to hold onto it or let it go. His breathing was slow, steady, too steady. His gaze hadn't left Sarah's body. The dispatcher was still speaking, asking questions, trying to keep Laura on the line, but the only thing she could focus on was the weight of the air in the room. Thick, heavy, pressing down on her chest. Emma was curled up on the floor near the bed, her knees drawn to her chest, her face buried in her arms. She wasn't moving, not crying, not speaking, just there. Then, distant at first, the sound of sirens. Growing louder. Closer. John lifted his head, finally looking at Laura. She flinched, clutching the phone tighter, but he didn't move toward her. He didn't move at all. Flashing red and blue lights painted the walls in flickering streaks. The sirens screamed louder. Tires screeched outside. Car doors slammed. The house was suddenly alive with voices. Barked orders. Heavy boots pounding up the front steps. Police. Open up. The door burst open. Officers flooded inside, guns drawn, faces tense. Their eyes darted between Laura, Emma, Sarah's unmoving body, and John, standing in the middle of it all, motionless. Drop the weapon. John didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't even hesitate. He let the gun slip from his fingers, metal hitting the floor with a hollow clatter. Then, he looked directly at the officer in front of him. His voice was quiet, flat, almost empty. She betrayed me. Hands grabbed his arms, shoved him forward, forced him to the ground. A knee pressed into his back as cold steel cuffs clamped around his wrists. Someone was still shouting, barking orders, but John didn't resist. He just closed his eyes. The voices blurred together. Laura was sobbing. Emma was silent. Someone was checking for a pulse on Sarah's body. Then, a voice confirming what they already knew. She was gone. The next time John opened his eyes, he was somewhere else. The walls were gray. The air smelled like sweat and disinfectant. Interrogation. The chair beneath him was stiff, uncomfortable. His hands, still cuffed, rested on the cold table. The blood on his skin had dried, leaving dark stains along his fingers, beneath his nails. He didn't try to wipe it off. A detective sat across from him, flipping through a file, watching him with careful eyes. "Do you understand what's happening right now, John?" Silence. The detective exhaled, shifting in his seat. "You shot your wife, Sarah Walker. You fired twice. She didn't survive. There were witnesses. Laura and Emma Walker both saw it happen. We have the 911 call. We have the weapon. We have you, standing over her body, admitting to it. This isn't a question of whether you did it. It's why." John didn't blink, didn't react. The detective leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Talk to me, John." A long pause. Then, finally, John spoke. "I saw them." His voice was quiet, almost too quiet. The detective tilted his head. "Saw what?" John swallowed, staring at nothing. "All of them." The detective waited. She thought she could hide it. "I wasn't supposed to know." Another stretch of silence. John flexed his fingers against the cuffs, feeling the cold bite of steel. Then, in a voice so low it was barely more than a whisper, he said it again. "I wasn't supposed to know." John sat in the courtroom, his hands clasped in front of him, wrists bare now, the weight of the cuffs replaced by something heavier. He had spent weeks locked away in a cell, staring at concrete walls, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights, waiting for this moment. The moment when a room full of strangers would decide if he would ever walk free again. The prosecution was ruthless. They painted him as a monster. A man who had spent years training to kill, who had honed his body and mind into a weapon, and who had finally turned that weapon on the one person he had sworn to love. They called it premeditated. They said the moment his fingers wrapped around the gun, he knew exactly what he was doing. They showed the jury pictures of Sarah, of the blood-soaked sheets, of the look frozen on her face as life drained from her body. Cold-blooded. That's what they called him. The defense fought back. John wasn't a monster. He was a soldier. A man conditioned to survive, trained to suppress fear, anger, grief. They told the jury about the things he had seen, the things he had done in the name of duty. They talked about the nightmares, the sleepless nights, the way he flinched at loud noises. The things that war did to a man. They spoke of betrayal, of how trust had been stripped away from him in the worst possible way. How he hadn't just lost his wife that night, he had lost everything. His home. His reality. The one thing he had believed in, the one thing he thought was his. Psychologists took the stand. They described betrayal trauma, the way the brain reacts when the foundation of a person's world is ripped out from under them. They talked about PTSD, about how soldiers learn to compartmentalize, how they bury emotions so deep they don't even know they're there until it's too late. They explained that John hadn't just seen an affair that night, he had seen a threat. And threats had to be eliminated. The jury watched as Laura took the stand. She was composed at first, her voice steady, her words precise. She spoke about Sarah, about the relationship they had rebuilt, about how they had grown close again. Then the questions turned sharper. The prosecutor asked her about the night of the shooting, about what exactly had been happening in that bedroom before John walked in. Her face changed. Her answers became shorter, clipped, careful. Emma went next. She was different. Fragile. Her hands shook when she gripped the edge of the stand, her voice barely above a whisper. When she was asked to describe what had happened that night, she hesitated. She looked at her stepmother before she answered. And in that hesitation, The courtroom felt something shift. Their stories didn't match. One of them was lying. Or maybe both. The jury noticed. The prosecution tried to steer the focus back. It didn't matter what Sarah had been doing before John pulled the trigger. It didn't matter what led up to that moment. The only thing that mattered was that a man had taken a gun and killed his wife. That was the crime. That was why they were all there. The closing arguments were made. Then the jury was sent to decide his fate. The wait stretched for hours. John sat there, staring ahead, unmoving. He didn't glance at Laura. He didn't look at Emma. He barely breathed. Then, the doors opened. The jury returned. Everyone in the room sat forward, the tension so thick it felt like it could crush them all. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. They had. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, held a piece of paper in shaking hands. Guilty. A sharp inhale from somewhere in the courtroom. A muffled cry. John didn't react. The judge read the sentence. 25 years to life. The gavel came down. It was over. As the bailiff approached him, John stood. His face was unreadable, his body still, his movements slow and deliberate. He had accepted his fate before he had even stepped into this courtroom. The reporters swarmed as he was led toward the exit, cameras flashing, voices shouting over one another, each one trying to get a piece of the story. One of them finally broke through the noise. "John, do you regret it?" He stopped, turned his head just slightly, eyes locking onto the reporter. A long pause. Then, in a voice that was steady, even almost too quiet to hear, he spoke. "If I had just walked away, she'd still be alive." Then he was gone. This was not a battlefield. There were no enemies hiding in the shadows. No mission objectives. No war to fight. Just a man, a husband, standing in his own home, looking at the one thing he was never meant to see. John Walker spent his life training to survive, to fight, to control his emotions so completely that nothing could shake him. He had been deployed in war zones, faced men who wanted him dead, witnessed horrors that would break most people. And yet, it wasn't war that undid him. It wasn't the battlefield that destroyed him. It was love. It was betrayal. It was the moment he walked through that bedroom door and saw the woman he had vowed to spend forever with, tangled in a secret too big to be hidden any longer. For a man who had spent years mastering control, the moment he pulled that trigger was the moment he lost everything. Was it premeditated? Or was it the kind of blind, uncontrollable fury that makes people do things they never thought themselves capable of? John had been trained to react to threats, to neutralize danger before it had the chance to strike first. But that night, in that house, the threat wasn't an enemy combatant. It wasn't a terrorist or a hostile force. It was the woman he had trusted more than anyone. 25 years to life. That was what the court decided. That was the punishment for taking her life. But is there a prison sentence long enough to make sense of what happened that night? Some people say justice was served. Others say a man like John Walker was already doomed long before he pulled the trigger. So, what do you think? Did John deserve his sentence? Or was this a crime that even justice can't explain? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear another story of a crime of passion that shook the world, click here next.